Okay, so this is our last webinar of 2024. I'm actually really excited to have everyone here and to do this. This is sort of a lot of the stuff that we've been thinking about, kind of compiled all year into one sort of master point of view on what's going on and what I think firms need to be doing about it right now. The title of this webinar has changed a couple times actually as I've kind of developed the content. It started out as sort of the battle for mind share when their competitor is a bot, kind of all hinging on this notion that we've seen this sort of flood of AI-driven content just hitting the marketplace over the last 12 months, content developed by AI. Um, it's changed because as I've been doing the research and really kind of building out the story, I sort of realized it's actually much bigger and broader than that. And actually, that's probably the least of your worries right now. If you are a marketer of a professional services firm or a senior leader or an editorial leader of a firm, um, you know, that expansion of AI generated content is not nearly as concerning as some of the other things going on. The biggest one being just a change in how clients seek and find firms. So that's really going to be the premise of everything today. So, okay, so here's our agenda. The first three bullets are really just sort of what's going on. I'm just going to call it what's going on. Search is dead, new media habits, who do we trust? So there's sort of like three kind of big macro things I think that are going on um, in the kind of broader media thought leadership landscape that are going to really radically change the way thought leadership works over the next decade. We're going to talk about three proven playbooks. So playbooks that we see that either have worked for years and will continue to work, and playbooks that are somewhat new and are the ones that I think are going to work in the next cycle of thought leadership. And then I'll spend some time talking about where to start. So let's roll. Okay, so a little bit of a bold statement from here, but the thought leadership playbook of the last 10 years is going to become obsolete over the next 5. So this is really kind of where this all started. It all started for me with this realization that these sort of AI search tools, for me it's Perplexity, for many of you it's ChatGPT, for others it's Google Gemini, maybe it's Bard, it's Copilot. It's some type of AI-enabled tool that's letting you collapse the research activities that you might have spent weeks on years ago with a traditional Google search tool into maybe minutes or hours. So it's that, for me, it's the Perplexity experience that I'm having where I'm interacting with Perplexity and I'm searching for information and it's summarizing everything out there in the world for me in a really compelling and simplistic way. And what it's doing, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, is it's essentially taking the activities you used to do, which would be going to sites and kind of reading what's on the site and trying to make an informed understanding of a situation or a problem. And it's sort of doing that for you, and it's keeping you in a self-contained universe. So you think about a lot of thought leadership programs that have been built over the last decade were built under the premise of an inbound marketing model. The idea was you're going to develop this high quality self-published content to your website, and that content is going to be a conduit for clients to find you. They're finding you for your expertise and the problems you solve, and they're finding you through Google. I am of the opinion that that is going away. So over the next 5 years, you're going to see a radical decline in that behavior from clients and buyers, and we're already seeing that, and you'll see some of that data. So what do you do? So I think that playbook of a steady drip of high quality self-published content for the purposes of traditional inbound or traditional organic search is not going to play anymore. So you have to pivot. Okay, so why do I say that? So there's three things going on that I think are really important here. The first is search is dead. This is really kind of actually hyperbole. What am I talking about, Jason? What do you mean search is dead? That's a ridiculous comment. It's not true. It's not true. So Google is still the most trafficked website on the entire internet, right? So globally, so it gets the lion's share of activity. 80% of people use a search engine every single month to do something, to go learn, to go find a firm, to go find an answer to a question, to find a restaurant, whatever. People are using search all the time. The problem is when I say search is dead, I'm not saying search as an activity is dead. What I'm saying is search as an inbound marketing vehicle is dead or dying. Here's the problem. 60% of those searches, so those millions upon billions of searches that occur every minute, are zero-click searches, meaning that the answer is found in the search. There's no need to go any further. So you think about, for those of us who've been at this game for a while, maybe you've been in thought leadership for over a decade. When Google first showed up, it was a collection of blue hyperlinks. And the experience that someone was having was to do a search and to click through those blue hyperlinks to try to understand something and learn something. Well, Google is basically answering those questions with a zero click, or 41% is one click. So you're talking about, like, what is that? Virtually all the search traffic is going to basically one result, and frequently that result is not that first link. It's a summary. This is another interesting statistic. 97% of web pages have no traffic, right? So if you're developing this thought leadership content or the premise that's going to lead to inbound authority, I think it's going to be really, really hard. So why is this going on? So if if you think back to the whole content marketing movement, the whole inbound movement that started, roughly 10 to 15 years ago, that was always the story. There was the content marketing world had this story about this guy who had a pool business that failed in the recession, and he started a blog, and then the blog was his path to success, right? And there's all these types of stories, and that's not really viable anymore, right? I don't think that's going to work. So what's going on? Well, the first thing is it started with Google just sort of making changes to the search experience. So what I'm showing here is a featured snippet. So it started with featured snippets, and the idea was you ask a question, and it's going to give you a summary of the answer, and of course the summary leads you to the more in-depth answer, and maybe you get enough in the summary. You don't have to go any further. So that painstaking thought leadership piece that you worked really hard to develop a strong point of view on that provides a compelling answer to a critical problem now just gets summarized in one paragraph by Google, and the reader says, well, I don't need to go any further. So it started there. It went from there to knowledge panels. So you see these pop up where, if they're asking about a firm, maybe they're trying to do due diligence on a company or a person, it just gives you that kind of right-hand whole summary about everything that's going on. So now, obviously, if you're doing due diligence on a professional services firm, I don't think you're going to make a decision right here. But what I'm really talking about in this context is, how do you actually get to the shortlist? How do clients seek you out? How do they vet you? How do they search for you? How do they find you if they don't know who you are? And if they're finding you through thought leadership, that's about issues that they need help with, and they're getting the answer before they ever get to you, that's going to be a problem, right? Now, of course, with AI, it's just kind of gotten even more aggressive, right? You look at this search query I did in Google to just make my point. I asked a really kind of arcane niche question, and it's generating an AI overview. Now, of course, that AI overview has links to sources, so it's not becoming the end all be all. It's definitely pointing to the sources that it's drawing from, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to go through. And it's often some tools don't offer that, right? On top of that, if I want to go one step further, so I'm showing kind of different phases of the buying journey. Like on the one hand, you have someone looking for business issues to think about as it relates to a technology implementation. On the other hand, you have someone looking for a consulting firm with a specific set of expertise, and it's just delivering kind of a grid, and that grid is largely AI based. And if I click on any one of those things, what does it do? It actually summarizes everything about that firm. Now, the interesting thing is, look at all the directional points on this. So I'm clicking through to learn about Accenture and Accenture's AI capabilities for a mid-sized retailer, I think was the query. And it's telling me what Accenture can do, but none of those things are pointing to Accenture at all. They're all pointing to other sources, right? So it's really interesting, right? And then the last thing is, you just have a lot of people just sort of going to AI-enabled search tools full stop. So for me, it's become Perplexity, right? I use Perplexity virtually all the time, and what I use it for is exactly what you see. Some of the threads on screen is to ask questions, maybe to learn about a company, to learn about a prospective client we're talking about, to learn about an issue, to understand the prevailing wisdom on a topic. A lot of the research that you'll see me talk about today, I actually sourced originally through Perplexity, right? So, and these tools are doing everything in their power to keep that experience self-contained. They don't want me to leave Perplexity at all. They want me to stay there, right? The more time I spend there, the higher their valuation, right? So this is a real problem. Now, I know what you're asking yourself is that this doesn't mean anything to me. Like, is this really going to affect a professional services firm? And the answer is, I believe it already is. So I went through and I looked at all of the sites that we have access to Google Analytics for. So these are all professional services firms that we either work with or have worked with in the past to look at search traffic this year. And I looked at the last 90 days compared to the last 90 days of last year. Unfortunately, when Google went to GA4, we kind of lost some of that history to be easily accessible. I mean, we have it, but digging through it takes forever. And this is what I found. I found on average that our professional services firms are seeing a decline in search traffic this year of about 2.5%. I think there's some interesting things in there. So the sites that have, very large site search traffic volume, so the ones that get maybe 50 or 60% of their traffic from search, are seeing a bigger decline, sometimes in the 20% range, so a significant decline. And that's because if you think about a site that gets a lot of search traffic, that search traffic is very much non-branded search traffic. It's traffic that's people looking for answers to questions, solutions to problems, right? A site that doesn't get a lot of search traffic, a lot of that traffic is going to be branded search. They're looking for the firm. And so they're clearly trying to get to the site, right? So we're seeing that. Notably, I wanted to point out we have a number of AE firms on the call that the AE firm slice that I looked at in there, which is not I don't remember how many firms was in that, was actually up a little bit year over year. So I don't think that this kind of like has hit that space yet, which is not a huge surprise. You think about sort of AE firm buyers, they're sort of slow to adopt sort of new ways of operating, I guess, when we saw that through kind of the shift into search and content marketing in the first place 12 years ago. All right, let's talk about new media habits. That's one thing. The second thing that kind of came to my realization as I was doing this is like there's certainly this one force, which is that AI is changing the way that clients would seek and vet potential firms for the problems that they're seeking to solve, right? That's definitely a thing, and I'm 100% convinced of that. Now, at the same thread, there's sort of like new media habits. I'm calling them new in quotations because I don't know that any of these things are super new. They're just things that have been accelerating. The first thing you see is this is an article from the Journal. New media is leaving the old guard behind. And the whole essence of the story is about the role of podcasts in the 2024 election cycle. And I would argue when this kind of all played out, there's a lot of reasons Trump won this election, but one of the reasons he definitely did is that his team always seems to have their thumb on the pulse of where to be from the media perspective. In 2016, they were all over social media. In 2024, they were all in on podcasts and they were showing up left and right everywhere they needed to be. So a very tactical media decision had a huge impact on the outcome of that election. And so we'll just look at some data that talks about this. So there's just a lot more activity in podcasts. So this is actually data from the Pew Research Center. This is terrestrial radio. I'd never even heard that phrase before this research, but which is traditional radio, right? Which has been in a slow decline for 20 years. So just people spending less and less time with traditional kind of analog audio, I guess, for lack of a better way of calling it. Simultaneously, your podcast listenership is way up, right? So it's up 2 to 3 times over that same 20-year cycle. So you have, people that listen to podcasts on a weekly basis is in the 30% range. People that have ever listened to podcasts is in the 60% range right now. So this continues to trend up aggressively. And you're going to see in here, one of the things I did, I actually decided, because there's definitely some generational things here, I decided to actually ask my 23-year-old niece like about her media habits a little bit to get a sense of what's coming. Because a lot of this, when you think about it, most of you are selling into someone that's probably my age, someone in their 50s, someone in their 40s, and they've kind of formed media habits and they've formed buying behaviors now. But when you think about thought leadership, we're often working on longer time frames, so we're thinking about how do we have to show up in the next 3 to 5 years, not just how we have to show up in the next 12 months. And so your buyers are changing. Your buyers are going to not be me in 5 more years. They're going to be the people behind me. They're in their 30s and 40s, right? And then certainly the people behind that in their 20s. So I just thought it was interesting to look at these kind of generational things a little bit, because as you're building your thought leadership program, you're not just building for your buyers today, you're building for your buyers tomorrow. And so I did this sort of chat thread with her to kind of ask her about the news cycle. And she's a smart kid, by the way. And she works in a chemistry lab. She's 23 years old. I'm like, hey, where do you go for information? And so this is what she came back. I said, basically, where do you get your news? She's like, hey, most of my friends get it from TikTok. They get it from Instagram. I get it from Joe Rogan and Tim Dillon. So she listens to podcasts. That's where she gets most of her news. I kind of put her on the spot. Do you consume any traditional news? No, it's just hyper liberal in her view, right? So she's formed an opinion about traditional news that she just doesn't pay any attention to it. And you'll see this sort of thread come up again. So my point is, when you think about, and I recognize she's not your buyer, but people like her are your future buyer, right? And so, and when you look at this data, when I pull it up here shortly, what you're going to see is that younger people are trending in these directions more aggressively than older people, and that's just going to continue. All right, social media just keeps grabbing more and more of people's time. So where do people give their time? They give it to social media. This is all research from Pew. You can see just sort of, again, versus virtually every main social media platform is ascending. So YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, doesn't really matter. Every single one is getting, more use on a sort of daily, annual basis. So if you're going to show up, it's going to continue to be, these are going to be places that you're going to need to show up. I really like this chart from their research. It was about social media use, and because they're cutting across household income, they're also cutting across education. So you think about who most of us are selling into. We're certainly selling into these high income earners with college degrees, and where are they in social media? Well, they're everywhere, right? So there's this kind of ongoing endless fallacy that our clients, we're not going to find clients on Instagram. We're not going to find clients on Facebook. I mean, we don't spend any time or resources there, but your clients are there. They're 100% there. They may not be there for business purposes necessarily, but they're there, I promise you. The one piece of data in here that I really do like to point out is this kind of big dark blue LinkedIn at 53% on the $100,000 range and 53% on the college plus range. So like LinkedIn continues to be probably the best place to reach decision makers right now in the social media landscape, in my view, just because it does have such a high concentration of highly educated people that you're trying to do business with. So this is important. All right, so then who do we trust? This was actually another one that kind of struck me as I was doing this that I found really interesting. I just think that trust is changing, and you saw that with that chat I was having a little bit, and I think this affects how you think about thought leadership in general, and we'll come back to it. Trust is just shifting away from institutions and brands. So, someone like me, I'm in my early 50s. I grew up, I came into the workforce in the mid 90s. And, when you think about the 80s and 90s, news was delivered in a very structured, controlled media, right? Brand messages were delivered through really structured, controlled advertising and PR programs. I think back to, I've been in the agency business for over 20 years. In the 90s, we spent a lot of time with clients really trying to figure out how to get complete control of the brand message. That was probably the vast majority of work that firms were thinking about is how do we present a consistent brand? How do we present a consistent message? How do we keep everybody on point all the time? That's like pretty much completely out the window over the last 20 years, right? You think about the last 20 years, what have we seen? We had free publishing tools, social media tools. It just sort of opened the message to virtually anyone and everyone. And now people can see inside, and whether they like it or not doesn't really matter. It just means that their sort of trust in the classic institutions is just degrading, so there's just less trust in the masthead than there used to be. And so that affects really you from the perspective of, if your thought leadership is leveraging PR, well, how's that going to change over time, right? If the client doesn't trust the masthead, then maybe you need to be somewhere else, right? Let's look at some data on this, just confidence in major U.S. institutions. This is actually Gallup research. They've been studying this for 40 years. And you can see on this, I believe it's US adults who have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in 9 different institutions. And it's gone from, 45% in the 1970s to 26%. So it's just sort of on this kind of slow decline. This is actually an Edelman Trust Barometer. This is all in one article showing just percentage in the US who worry that business leaders are purposely trying to mislead people is 60%, right? Journalists report 60%. So there's just kind of this general sense that I can't trust these companies anymore. I can't trust these brands anymore. And when you think about thought leadership, what that means is, we've had a lot of conversations over the last decade with firms that are afraid to byline stuff. They're afraid to put a byline on an article because they want it to come from the brand, they want it to come from the firm. But the reality is people increasingly are they're shifting their trust to people. So they're trusting individuals more than they trusted the brand years ago. And these are just examples of influencers. I mean, I know we all know about the influencer economy, and whether we like it or not doesn't really matter. It's just the reality of sort of where we are right now, that there's just this big shift, and it's come out of social media and podcasts, where people are more likely to trust a person than they are to trust a brand. And these are just different examples. Tucker Carlson from the news cycle, and Rogan, and I think that's for I can't say his name. Farad, I can't think of his last name. And then Scott Galloway, who I follow in the business press a lot. I mean, he's very provocative and very opinionated, and very smart on technology, and very crass. And he's got a huge followership. At the bottom right is a guy named Nikolai Tangin. I like this guy a lot. It's really interesting. He hosts a podcast called In Good Company, where he interviews CEOs of major corporations, and it's one of the most listened to podcasts from senior business leaders. But what's interesting is, you have this thing where they're trying to just have conversations with CEOs. It's not an initiative of it's not about the Norges Bank brand that's front and center. It's about the CEO, right? They're making him more accessible, and they're trying to make the people on the other side more accessible, right? And now, I'm not going to bore you with all the details here. Pew also did a really interesting research study on news influencers. So when people think of influencers, we always think of like fashion and entertainment and that kind of stuff, but there's a huge audience of news influencers. And this is just from their research. It's over 500 influencers that have over 100,000 followers. So people that are influencing the news cycle through various social media or various podcast programs. You can see that that's where increasingly people are getting their news, and especially younger people. So 40%, 4 out of 10 adults under 30, that's where they're getting their news. I did the same kind of chat conversation with my niece just to kind of see, because she had mentioned in her previous chat that she pays attention to Tucker Carlson. So I'm like, okay, who you trust more, Fox News or Tucker Carlson? Oh, Tucker Carlson for sure. Right? So like, I think as we look ahead at who we're selling into over the next 10 years, it's going to change. It's going to be, the expectation is that your people are more front and center than maybe they used to be. And a lot of firms are not super comfortable with that. They're not comfortable with bylining an article. Some firms are certainly comfortable with that. Most firms are. But there are definitely firms that are not super comfortable with letting their people be full humans, sort of be the Scott Galloway, be this sort of out there kind of semi-crazy guy, kind of using his own personal stories and talking about all kinds of things that would normally seem as taboo or off-putting for a corporate brand. So I think the expectation is you're going to have to let your people be humans a little bit more than maybe they've been in the past, whether you like it or not. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on. And now I recognize that some of the things I'm telling you are things that are emerging and things that are not necessarily affecting you right now, but they're the things that I think are the big picture changes that we're seeing in sort of media consumption, search behaviors that are going to shape the way you think about thought leadership over the next decade. So I feel very strongly that the last decade was very much Google's decade, right? Like that was, if you were running a thought leadership program, one of the most important things you were trying to unlock for the last 10 to 15 years was to figure out how to show up in a Google search, because that Google search inferred tons of trust and authority, right? Well, that world is going to be a very difficult world to play in. So I think you have to look at different ways to do this going forward. So we're going to look at three proven playbooks, three playbooks that we see firms executing and implementing with success, going against these currents. Well, the first one is sort of like the tried and true proven playbook of thought leadership that has been run for 50 years. So it's not like this is a new playbook at all. It's just the traditional thought leadership program that major firms were running back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I call it discover what no one knows. It's basically, in-depth, multidimensional research that looks at a very specific business issue that clients are struggling with dramatically. The example I'm showing on screen is actually research done by a group called DCM Insights, a guy named by the name of Matthew Dixon, who co-authored a book called The Challenger Sale about 15 years ago. In this article in HBR, he's profiling their latest research on the habits of the most successful partners in professional services firms from a sales perspective, a business development perspective. And the research they did took them about a year worth of research with 25 firms, 1,600 partners. They did 30-minute surveys of business development habits. They had leaders score the performance of their partners from a business development perspective. They did in-depth interviews with 125 people from across the top 5 performers in all 25 of those firms. And they did in-depth regression analysis. So that's a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you. But basically, the essence is they spent over like 12 to 15 months on a very deep, multidimensional research study to arrive at a very core key insight, that there is a certain type of partner that performs better from a business development perspective that they're coining the activator. They've published that in an HB article. They published it in a book here in May of this year. That book then led to opportunities in what I'm calling new media, right? So that actually the HB article led to a live webinar that they did, or like LinkedIn live video that they did for LinkedIn. It led to podcast opportunities like one with us on Rattle and Pedal. In fact, I like to say we scooped LinkedIn and we even scooped HBR because we had the interview done before HBR even had their article written. This is traditional kind of in-depth, meaningful research on a really specific business issue that's launched through traditional earned media that's leading to new media opportunities. And my understanding is that the firm has sort of outstripped its capacity. So there's more demand for their training services around this core insight than they're able to fulfill. So if this is the playbook you're going to run, it's, many of your firms, if you're a, tier 1 consulting firm, this is a playbook you've been running for a very long time. So it's not necessarily anything new, but for other firms, this would be definitely a new model. Multidimensional research goes deep inside organizations. So multidimensional being the key. A traditional earned media publishing approach that leads to new media. And I call this, I'm using some baseball analogies. It's sort of you're chasing for a grand slam, right? Like you're trying to hit it out of the park because you're putting easily 15 months of effort into the research process to try to get to a foundational insight that's so novel and so profound that it's going to create essentially a whole new market for in this case training services that maybe wasn't there before. Okay, so that's sort of the most traditional playbook. Playbook number 2 is what I'm calling a repeatable research model. In this case, what I'm showing you here is the National Center for the Middle Market, which is a client of ours. This is something that they built called the Middle Market Indicator. It tracks confidence and growth in the US middle market on a biannual basis. So twice a year, we survey 1,000 middle market executives, and we systematically publish what we learn every July and every January. And each release builds upon the last, each release trends on the last, and it basically is the fulcrum into the market for the research center. It's basically the way that the center gets visibility around the middle market and its role in researching and understanding the middle market. All right. So this release is self-published. It's released on a predictable cadence, and it's got picked up by all kinds of traditional media. This is in the last 6 months, places that have picked up kind of the latest research and findings, as well as a podcast where the managing director was featured. I'll show you another example of this. It's also led to HBR articles for the center. I'll show another example of this, another client of ours. This is Tercera, an investment capital firm that invests in IT services firms. This is something they call the Tercera 30, which is on year 3. The Tercera 30 is a study of the 30 most attractive software ecosystems for a IT services firm to build a business around. So it's where do you invest your partner relationships? The research, they look at about 150 to 200 software companies on an annual basis. They look at about 30 dimensions, and they look for the best places to play. And the thought leadership is driven around, actually, the founder, Chris Barbin, conceived of this idea when they started the fund, because he had run an IT services firm successfully and sold it to Wipro. And he said through his whole journey, he always wished he had more data to inform his decisions around partner ecosystems. Like, what software companies should you be working with and why? And so that's why they release this. And they do it every year. It's repeatable. It releases upon itself. And it creates awareness for the firm. It generates leads in the form of possible companies to fund, in the form of banking relationships, in the form of media relationships. It's also actually bucked the trend of the search thing game I told you. So, you know, this is some of the key takeaways. You know, unlike other places where we're seeing search decline, we're actually seeing search climb here. They're getting more search traffic. And if you think about why is that? Because this repeatable research experience can't really be consumed through the intermediary that is an AI search tool, right? Like, it can summarize the findings, but it can't deliver the full experience, all the insight that I can gather. So it's obviously led to press pickups and press mentions. So let's look at the key characteristics of this type of playbook. So key things here is I call it multi-year commitment to a repeatable longitudinal research. And so the beauty of these things is that they're not one-offs. A lot of what you see in thought leadership research is a study. We do a study on this topic, and then we release the findings. And it maybe works, maybe it doesn't work. And the firm is maybe disappointed with the results because they didn't give it enough time to do its job. So when you do this over years, essentially what you're building is you're building a repository of information that builds upon itself. And you become known as a topical expert, and people start to anticipate the release. So that MMI I showed you, they get lots of news coverage in every cycle because news media starts to look forward to when this data is going to come out. So again, predictable publishing cadence that leads to earned media opportunities, both traditional and new. Each release builds upon the last. I call this frequently hitting doubles. It's like it's sort of a predictable process. You can build a lot of awareness around it. You can build a lot of excitement for it, and you can build a lot of credibility. You know, in the case of the National Center for the Middle Market, it became known for the middle market indicator, which made it recognized as the leading voice of the U.S. middle market, which led to tons of earned media over time. For Tercera, it's becoming known for the Tercera 30. The Tercera 30 is seen as an incredibly valuable resource for IT services firms that are trying to make these difficult decisions about where to partner. And it's then creating opportunities for Tercera to make investment choices. All right, let's look at playbook number 3, which I think is probably the closest playbook to the traditional playbook that we've been running with for the last decade, this idea of search indexable content that's published to a blog, perhaps. What you're seeing here is I'm calling elevate a voice. And in this case, we're kind of leaning into some of those trends that I described earlier, this idea that we have to elevate individuals. We have to elevate people, not just focus on issues all the time. So this is a client of ours named Jump Associates, which is a strategy firm out of Silicon Valley that works with Fortune 50 companies. And it all starts for them with a master point of view around future focus, the idea of really that most organizations fail and get disrupted because they don't take a long-term lens. They focus on the next quarter or the next year or the next 3 years when they need to be really focusing on the next 5 to 7 years. They need to take a longer view of what they're doing and why they're doing it. There's core issues underlying that. You know, there's that the firm has studied around purpose-driven companies, innovation, discovering core strengths. So there's a sort of a topical grid around this very clear master point of view of future focus that drives everything. And everything that they're doing is about really elevating that message through the lens of the people, through the personality of the founder, Dave Patnaik. So you can see they have a podcast that they host and they release about twice a month. And it's a conversation about future focus. It's a conversation for future focus leaders. And they talk about all these issues. They talk about what it means to be a purpose-driven organization. They talk about what it means to be future focused and how to think about it and why companies can't and the challenges of doing that. The podcast is the basis for a recurring Forbes article series that Dave writes, where they write about these issues on a monthly basis, and it's the basis for a recurring newsletter that is written as a very personal note from Dave Patnaik to his friends and clients, and encouraging people to share. A lot of the way that they measure feedback on this is not necessarily with clicks and links and leads, it's replies and conversations. So, virtually every newsletter that goes out in the cycle, because it has this very personal feel, gets a reply, and it generates sort of a conversation that way. They also run an offsite, so they run an in-person event. And so you can see really the essence of this story is that it's all about bringing out the personality of the thought leader in Dave, bringing out the point of view of the firm, future focus, and the issues that they want to cover in a very human, personal way. And it combines a mix of new media and old media, right? So it's got a mix of earned media, published articles in a reputable place like Forbes, a recurring podcast, an email newsletter, and it all kind of syncs together into one thing. So if I were sitting in, if I were sitting in 2024, which I am, and I had a small to mid-sized firm and I was trying to think about how I was going to market it going forward, this is probably the model that I would choose, because it's sort of like blog 2.0 in a way. It's like if you would have started a blog 15 years ago, now you would start something that looks like this: a podcast, a video series, an earned media opportunity, a newsletter, all these things that let you get your message into the marketplace, but also bring out the humans that, as a carrier of that message. So key characteristics, it's building the firm's reputation by elevating an individual thought leader around a master point of view. Most important part, pulling from a unique personality. I mentioned Scott Galloway earlier. He's a very kind of bombastic guy. A lot of people dislike him. A lot of people like him. And so sometimes it's bringing out that personality and letting someone really connect with the individual that's the carrier of the message. Starts with new media. So some of the examples I showed you in the other playbooks, it was sort of starting with maybe self-published content or earned media and having that create new media opportunities. In this case, we're starting with a podcast. We're starting with a podcast, or we're starting with a video. We're starting with a conversation in a more kind of new media way that's leading to other opportunities. Pairs with earned media, drips into the market on a weekly basis. So it's something that is just sort of kind of like that old blog. It's like you're going to do this to build a following over time, and you're going to build a relationship with these people in the hopes that they share with their friends and bring more people into your fold. You're building a community. A lot of the things that Jump has done so well, they talk about this, is that it's very much about building a community of future focused leaders. And it's not any surprise that the last few years have been some of their best years since they implemented this strategy about 2 years ago. I call this regularly getting on base. So it's like if playbook number 1 is you're trying to hit a grand slam, and playbook 2 is you're just sort of hitting doubles every year, this is you're just getting on base every day. So every week you're getting on base. It's very much similar to the cadence you've probably built in your firms around monthly blogging habits, building a blog over time, kind of this marathon that you've been running. You're running a marathon, you're picking a master point of view, you're focusing on a handful of issues to own, and you're relentlessly talking about them for all time. Okay, so where to start? We're going to shift here into kind of my thoughts on what's next and a Q&A. So what to do? Here's 3 things I think that you need to do. First is, I think in the next 7 days, I would recommend everybody on this call take the time to look at your search traffic. Look at the last 90 days of 2024, compare them to the last 90 days of 23. If you can go back to 22, go back to 22. See if you're seeing this trend in just a decline in search traffic. You can also look for traffic from these sort of AI-enabled search tools and see if you're getting traffic from there. That actually generally shows up as referral traffic, so you'll see it as referral traffic from Perplexity or ChatGPT. You won't see much. I think this is the part that's most alarming, is that you might have lost 20% of search traffic in the last year at the hands of these AI-enabled tools, and you might have picked up 2% from ChatGPT, right? So you're losing a lot of traffic, and that you're probably not going to recover right away until you implement a new playbook. In the next 45 days, I would say convene a leadership discussion about your thought leadership approach and say, hey, what is our approach here? And in this case, I'm not talking about your strategy. I'm not talking about the issues you want to own or your master point of view. I'm talking about your approach. How are you actually getting your thinking into the marketplace and getting it found by clients that matter, clients you want to do business with? I think that's a really important discussion to have right now, because when I got into this 12 years ago and I made this case for Google search, and I made this case for content marketing and blog marketing for a lot of professional services firms who had never done it before, a lot of them looked at me like I was crazy. Like, you're crazy. Our clients are never going to go to Google and search for a firm like ours. Well, of course they have, and they are, and now they're going to do it less. And so I'm sure a lot of you are thinking the same thing as, Jason, you're crazy. No one's going to listen to a podcast and hire us. No one's going to go into ChatGPT and do this real quick light search on the best firms for this and hire them. Well, it's already happening. I can point to two specific clients where one of our clients picked up a major consulting deal in Africa from a ChatGPT query, and one of our clients actually made a very significant business decision based on a TikTok video. So, these are real things, man. These are real things. So it's going to keep happening. In the next 3 months, I would just say decide if and how to adjust your thought leadership playbook. If you're using the playbook that I see as kind of dying, is it, how much longer can you ride that downhill? I think you can probably ride it a lot longer than you think, but I don't think you should only ride it, right? That if you're losing 2.5% of search traffic in a year, that's not so bad, but I think that's going to continue, and no amount of like SEO wizardry is probably going to bring that back, because that playbook is not going to work 3 to 5 years from now. So just decide if and how to adjust. In here, I included a leadership discussion guide, just sort of 6 questions, I think 6 questions you can have with your leadership as a marketing leader, just to kind of get this dialogue going. Like, what would this look like? What if all of our search traffic disappeared? What if we had no search traffic at all? It's sort of like the thought exercise of, what if we had no referrals at all? A lot of firms rely heavily on referrals. It's sort of the similar idea, right? What if none of our clients trusted the traditional arbiters of trust for our firm? Maybe you're in an AE firm and you're like, man, if we get featured in E&R, that's a big deal, right? Or we get an article placement in civil engineering, that's a big deal. Those are big deals. What if they're not a big deal? What if like 10 years from now you wake up and that's completely irrelevant? Where else would you need to be? I'll jump ahead, but if we could elevate only one thought leader, who would it be and why? I'm not suggesting you should only elevate one, but my point is, you've got to get to the place where you have to recognize that potential clients are building a relationship with the individual as much as they are with the firm. And so you've got to do everything you can to elevate that individual and give the buyer an opportunity to build that relationship with that individual, because that's where trust is going to be in the future. So maybe it's your CEO, right? Maybe the play is to get your CEO to be more visible and more out there. What are the risks with that? So that's my discussion guide. Feel free to grab this off the slides if you decide to have this conversation inside your leadership team. And this is how we can help. Obviously, there's 3 things that many of you know we do. Strategy. So first is helping you identify that master point of view and issues to own, everything you saw sort of in that jump playbook around future focus and sort of the issues underlying that. We were a big part of helping them bring those to life. This is all out of order. Development is just partnering with our writers, editors, and designers to build these types of playbooks, to develop a repeatable research program or elevate a thought leader. That's what we do all day, every day. So if you want our help building a playbook like one of these, certainly reach out. And the last is training. We've done a lot of work in the last 12 months just helping organizations get better at working together around thought leadership. So get subject matter experts and content developers working together and moving in the same direction, which is always a kind of evergreen problem for making thought leadership work. So with that, I'm 3 minutes late. I said I'd be done at 45. It's 48. So let's go to questions and answers. I'm going to take a breath. I probably talked so fast, I just wore you all down. But feel free to chime in with questions, and I will give you a second to do that. So, okay. I'll try to read this. It's long. I love your repeatable research idea. When I was in marketing with KPMG, we did an annual meta survey of the economy over the next few years. It combined the forecast from several different banks and other sources. It was research the firm already did as part of their actuarial practice. They just took an internal report and made it pretty for external use. We did this annually, and each year got a lot of media pickup. What other ways can companies use data they already gather to create useful original content and make it useful to external markets? I think that's a really great example. The one thing I didn't talk about today, but it's just this idea that a lot of firms already do the research necessary for these sort of repeatable research experiences. Like the example I like to give a lot is Salesforce does these state of research reports, state of B2B sales or state of B2B marketing that they publish every year in a research report. And my criticism of that is that when you publish them as a research report, they show up as one-offs. So the whole idea of longitudinal is that these things build upon each other. So when you build it as an experience, the experience then people come back to it again and again and again every time you touch it, and they get to interact with not only this year's data but last year's data and the data from the year before that. So you look at that MMI experience I showed you. The thing that's most valuable is trends over time. That's what people really are interested in, really care about, right? So that's probably the thing that's most valuable. Other ways, I think that certainly that's one way. I think the other way is certainly using it as fodder for podcasts or other things that you might do, right? Other new media things that you're already doing. Okay. See here, I'll take maybe one or two more here. How do I pick the right topics? I always think that's one question that we get a lot is how do I pick the right topics to develop something like this about? Whether I'm trying to build a master point of view, identify issues to own, whatever it might be, how do I pick the right topics? Really, for us, it always starts with interviews, so we always start with interviewing your clients and asking them what are their most biggest pressing concerns. Looking at your book of business and seeing what are clients hiring for you for, not the project, the problem. Like what is the problem they're trying to solve and why? Why are they trying to solve it, and what are the hurdles along the way? And what are the hurdles maybe that you're not seeing as part of the work? So always start with that. So interviews with clients, interviews with subject matter experts, interviews with business development folks. And then the last question I'll take here is always about time. So, everything I showed you, the question is always, it's like, well, Jason, that's going to take forever, right? Like if I build this repeatable research experience, or I try to elevate an individual the way you suggested, we do a video series or a podcast series, and we build this kind of newsletter, or we build this article series. That's going to take a really long time. And the reality is yeah, of course it is. Each of these operates on different time scales. You think about that kind of trying to hit a grand slam story I told in the very beginning, that sort of playbook number one. You look at the journey that DCM Insights went on in the example I gave. I mean, you're talking about it easily a 5-year journey, right? Over a year in research, over a year, maybe 2 years, in getting that, synced into a book and into the marketplace. And so it's taking time. You're 3 years, probably 2 to 3 years in before you're starting to really see the meaningful return from the business investment. I think on the other end, you look at like elevating an individual voice, building let's say it's a podcast, you're building a video series with one of your thought leaders. You might be in the market within 3 to 6 months and seeing some trickle activity within 9, right? So that's going to be a much faster turn. So, I think that's another piece. I didn't put it in those characteristics, but the idea of when you look at these different playbooks, you're sort of looking at different time horizons. The Tercera story I told in the middle, we're going to release a podcast interview about the 2024 release of the Tercera 30 and the business case behind Tercera on Rattle and Pedal within the next month. and because we just recorded it yesterday. And one of the things that I loved about the conversation there was Michelle Swan, who's the marketing lead for Tercera, said, year one, we weren't super happy with what we got out of it, but it just sort of builds a little bit every year. So by year three, she's like, yeah, we're getting meaningful leads from the 3 different sources we're interested in. And we're getting media pickups, and we're getting people with inquiries asking us for advice. So it's just like anything, you have to give it time. So when you started to build a search-based or a blog-based thought leadership program 12 years ago, it took you 18 months to get those first hints of success, and then 3 years before you really started to see it really working. And I think you're going to expect the same thing for certainly playbooks 2 and 3. Um, so with that, we're gonna take it to wrap. I hope you enjoyed the comments. Hopefully, I know I went super fast. Hopefully you were able to keep up. I apologize if it was just too much too fast. Obviously, you can hit the replay and slow it down, and we will publish the slides, publish the recording here within the next day or two. So thanks for your time. Wishing you all a great rest of 2024. And certainly for those of you that we have worked with or have not worked with, would love to hear from you in 2025. So have a great day.